Well, hello and welcome to today's program, Digital Infrastructure Investments Impact on Future Economies. We are welcoming a bunch of folks who are coming in right now, so I am here to do introductions. My name is Alyssa Miller, and before I do introduce our program's moderator and the panelists, I want to be sure everyone knows how to use the control panel on this platform. As an attendee, you are automatically muted, and we will be accepting questions throughout the program today. Simply type them into the question window, and our moderator will do the best he can to address them. If you do not see a question window, you can go ahead and address questions to me or to our panelists through the chat window, and I'll be monitoring that as well. Today's program will be recorded and shared to all registered attendees. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dan Thompson, the Principal Research Analyst for Data Center Services and Infrastructure at 451 Research / S&P Global. Dan Thompson.
All right, thank you so much, Alyssa. And would love to just reiterate her comment there. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and we want this to be informative for you. So consider this your time, not our time. So however we can be helpful, please do let us know. So before we jump into the panel, what I would like to do is open with just a few remarks here, hopefully to kind of set the stage for what it is that we're going to be talking about, and then I'll introduce our panelists in just one second. So by the end of 2024, S&P is estimating that the United States will have almost 47 gigawatts of built-out data center capacity spread across all data center types. And what I mean by that is inclusive of hyperscale-owned, hyperscale-leased, other leased facilities, enterprise facilities, and even crypto mining facilities. So by the end of the decade, we're estimating that this number will grow by another 50 gigawatts. And I have to admit, like even saying that, I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there. But considering all the build pipelines that we know about, plus taking into account various utilities plans, it seems that this is the future that we're headed towards. But let's just say it's half that. These are still extremely large numbers. In the United States, data centers account for less than 10% of the entire load demand on the nation's power grids. However, it's not the current percentage that's actually sort of concerning our energy analysts, it's the growth rate. So currently data centers are growing at a compound annual growth rate of about 15% between the years 2019 and 2029, while other demand sources like commercial and residential are growing at low single digits. So the demand is significant and the pace at which it's growing is astounding. So taking this at the national level, however, doesn't really give us a solid view of the impact data centers are having on the country. If we take a look at Northern Virginia, for example, which is the United States' largest data center market, second only to Beijing globally, data centers are expected to account for more than 40% of the demand on its grid by 2030. Looking at Reno, one single data center project has been proposed that is the equivalent of the current load demand of the entire northern half of the state. So these are like big asks that are coming in. Now, I should also point out here, it's important to note that while this capacity, much of it anyway, is being built to service the likes of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, and so on, these companies are also among the top corporate buyers of renewable energy around the globe. In fact, Amazon, Meta, Google, and Microsoft rank first, second, third, and fourth respectively in contracted renewable energy capacity as of March of this year here in the United States. That ranking is actually expected to change, however, as Microsoft announced multiple renewable deals that were sizable in both April and May. I say all this to say, while it is true that data centers are consuming a lot of energy, at the same time, it is true those companies behind these data centers, so the hyperscalers and other data center developers, are also bringing on a tremendous amount of renewable energy at the same time. It is fair, though, we believe, to take a step back and just ask, is it all worth it? Ultimately, is the economic impact of all this data center development, is it worth it? And how is it benefiting the communities that they're being built in, as well as the nation itself, which is what we're here to discuss today. So I'm actually joined by a very astute group of panelists. which we believe are uniquely equipped to help us unravel all this. So let me pause first here and let them introduce themselves. And how about we just go alphabetically by first name, which Chris, if I have figured this up properly, that's you. So Chris, if you'll start.
Right. Sounds good. I'm Chris Gatch. I am the Chief Revenue Officer at DC BLOX, a data center owner, developer, and operator focused on the southeastern United States.
Awesome. Clark, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dan. Let's see, I began my career practicing international law in Europe and later spent 15 years in the utility industry with Duke Energy and most recently the past few years at Google. I'm now principal at 2156 Consulting, which is an advisory and consulting firm that assists data center companies with their site selection, governmental relations, incentive negotiations, and of course, work with utility companies in their economic development. So thank you, Dan, and pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you, sir. Corey, I believe you're next.
Yeah, thanks. My name's Corey Lemming. I'm the business unit leader for advanced technology at Evans General Contractors. I've spent my last 16 years really focused on digital and technology infrastructure. Some of my notable projects are Apple Park in California and many megawatts of construction for hyperscalers and developers. So I appreciate you guys having me here today.
All right. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Dan Golding.
Hi, my name is Dan Golding. I spent about 25 years in the digital infrastructure business. Last 15 years as an engineering and operations executive at places like NTT Data Centers, Iron Mountain, where I was the co-founder of Iron Mountain Data Centers, and the last decade or so at Google, where I was a network and data center engineering director. At the moment, I'm Chief Technology Officer at Appleby Strategy Group, where I provide advisory services to data center operators, as well as doing data center real estate development.
All right, very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Hopefully that gives our audience a good taste of who it is that will be speaking to them today and addressing these topics. So let's jump right into it if we can. Chris, if I can start with you. Obviously, we're not building data centers for the sake of building data centers here. These data centers have a purpose. If you wouldn't care, just sort of let's start there at a very high level. What is the point of all these data centers?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the reality that data centers are an economic necessity. If you look at, I would say, where we are today, we transact most of the basic functions of our society from a data center. And I think for most of us, this is probably is something we experience every day. But everything from a transaction in a retail store to the management of traffic lights when you're driving on the road, to phone calls that you make from your cell phone, to every website that you search, everything that we do in terms of modern society has a physical component on computers that run in data centers. So they truly, even from where we sit today, have become an essential part of our societal function. Then you add in where we're heading, which is into artificial intelligence, and we're going to talk some about AI. And this is what is driving all of the historic demand for data centers that you're reading about in the press. And many of the statistics you'll hear are a single AI query can be as much as 10 times the data center required power capacity of a single Google search. And not only that, you compound the amount of power that is needed for AI, but more importantly, you look at that in the context of how important AI is going to be. So we're at a point now where, again, basic functions of society depend on transactions that occur in data centers. Data analysis occurs in data centers. And now where we're heading is to intelligent systems that are literally going to underpin our societal structure. So, and frankly, determine the competitiveness of many nation state level, nation states. So data centers, I'd say, are where we are an essential part of society, becoming a more essential part of society, and the demands associated with them are getting more complex.
Yeah, I think what you were describing there is a definite value chain kind of associated here with these facilities. So it's oftentimes not even the single customer. So like let's just say Microsoft is a customer of the data center. They will have customers who are doing interesting things, who have customers that are doing interesting things. It really kind of creates this. It's a true chain there. And I guess Dan, if I can kind of go over to you, sort of expand on that idea. It can be sort of hard to sort of quantify the value of these buildings and the value that they're bringing to the communities. But can you kind of help us think through that a little bit?
Yeah, so it is tough sometimes, and people sometimes make assumptions that, oh, there's a bunch of data centers here, we're gonna have something like better broadband connectivity. That's unfortunately rarely true. Instead, what we see an awful lot is tax revenue. The number one byproduct of data center development is tax revenue that generally goes directly to schools. I live in Loudoun County, Virginia. Probably next year, there's going to be about $1 billion of data center tax revenue going right to the county, which will pay, for schools. And it's a pretty amazing situation when you can be in there. Even in places with sort of smaller data center developments, there really are very few counties or towns that don't want $100 million or $150 million of school revenue. It can be really, really transformative. There are other advantages too. You can get a lot of jobs, and I know there's sort of conventional wisdom that data centers don't bring jobs. Data centers bring about 1 job per megawatt. And you have to look at not just the operator of the data center, but you have to look at their customers, at their contractors, at the support staff, at the whole picture. And you can certainly at a large enough data center or data center complex have hundreds and thousands of good paid jobs. But at the end of the day, for almost everywhere that I've talked to, it comes down to a lot of tax revenue without a lot of costs. So most of the time, the county or the town doesn't have to build new schools. They don't have to build new roads. They don't have to build new infrastructure. All of that is paid for by the data center. So that tax revenue, it isn't offset by significant expenses the way it would be with a lot of residential construction, for example. So it's a pure and usually continuous source of revenue for the local authority having jurisdiction for many, many years.
I want to come back to that idea of jobs actually here in just a minute if we can, but let me bring in Clark. Clark, given your past and current employment, I feel like you're probably going to have some interesting perspectives here on what data centers are bringing into the communities. What have you seen these companies do in terms of investing in their local communities and so on?
Yeah, Dan, so let me kind of pull together some of the comments from Chris and Dan. So beyond the job creation and the significant capital investment, which in some cases, as Dan mentioned, exceeds $1 billion, most all data center companies that I have worked with or worked for are very conscientious and involved corporate citizens in their communities. So let's first talk about the impact they have on the business community, because data centers are an integral part of the local business community. So as Chris mentioned, data centers enable most all of the data that we depend on in our day-to-day lives. So think about financial transactions, communications, emergency services, online shopping, distance learning, video conferences, remote business meetings, along with our 8.5 billion Google searches each day. Data centers, remote connectivity, think about that. That helps to minimize our carbon footprint. So for instance, this webinar, everyone attending, no one had to get in a car and drive to the airport this morning and fly to a destination city and sit in a conference room all day. Now, multiply that by thousands or millions of people in their day-to-day remote connectivity. Therein lies the positive impact on the environment that data centers have in minimizing all of our carbon footprints. Data centers also provide the critical infrastructure to a community or a region. And by critical infrastructure, I'm speaking namely about power, water, and fiber. So data centers bring that internet connectivity to unserved or underserved rural communities. Now, that's at the local business level. Now, at the local community level, data centers typically provide hundreds and in some cases thousands of hours in local community volunteer work. They typically are very strong supporters of local STEM education programs. They work closely with K through 12 schools. They donate computers and computer software equipment. As Dan mentioned, they really have little to no impact on the demand for the local social services or governmental services. They contribute to local charities, food banks, community improvement projects. The other thing about data centers is they actually help to attract other diverse, high-skilled, high-wage jobs to the area. They typically open source their energy efficiency and sustainability practices. I know the ones I've been involved with, they share best practices and latest technology tools with the local community and businesses, which in turn helps to spur growth and innovation in the community. So these are just a few of the really high-level economic benefits a data center brings to a local community.
Yeah, I really like your thoughts there, especially your comment there on sustainability, and I want to circle in on that. Google is definitely at the forefront of sustainability type efforts. In my personal opinion, they have the most transparent reporting of any of the companies out there that are working to actually do hour-by-hour matching instead of annualized accounting. Very interesting things. And to your point, like they're sharing this with communities that they're operating in, so they're not doing this in a vacuum or being very secretive. As I mentioned, they're being very transparent. So yeah, that's very good. Chris, you were kind of nodding there like you were about to say something. I don't want to move on if you had something top of mind there.
No, go ahead, Dan. You're
okay. So Dan, let me come back actually to that employment question, if I may. And you somewhat answered this already, but let's just call it what it is. So a common critique of the data center industry is that they don't actually hire a lot of people. Is that true or false?
So that's a great question. When people were building 5 or 8 megawatt data centers, it was absolutely the case. There just weren't a lot of employees that you needed at a data center that large. But folks are making the same projections when we're building 300 megawatt campuses. And that is just a sort of category error. A typical 300 or 400 megawatt campus, has hundreds of people working there. You got everything from security and sort of cable technicians to critical facility staff to engineers. You've got frequently customer and contractor personnel. A lot of those jobs are pretty high paying. Certainly above the median. So I think it's important to kind of look at what is being built. The other piece that's important, and maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, apologies for jumping ahead, is construction. People are very quick to dismiss, quote unquote, temporary construction jobs. But in a lot of the areas that are concentrated areas of data center development, people are in those quote unquote temporary data center construction jobs for 10, 15, 20 years. So they're not so temporary as people want to believe. These are long-term positions where you go from one data center construction project to the next indefinitely.
Yeah, let me circle on the construction job in just one second. But Chris, I mean, you obviously work for a data center provider, so you have a very unique view here. Tell us about the types of jobs that you see being created, and more specifically, who is getting hired in positions.
Yeah, and it's changing a lot. The data center campus that we're developing right now in Lithia Springs, Georgia. Just let me put that in perspective for you to kind of where we are now in terms of an industry. On a 55-acre site that was originally conceived to house a logistics warehouse, we repurposed that site because of its availability to power as a data center campus. And we are now concentrating, rather than maybe a $40 million logistics building, we will invest $1.2 billion of development on that 55-acre site. We'll concentrate that much capital on the same amount of land. In addition to that, on all of the power that we are consuming, and we'll pay sales tax will be paid on much of the equipment that goes in that data center. And then in addition to that, sales tax is paid on the power that is consumed at that location. And then we get to the jobs. And Dan is exactly right. On a data center the size of the one we're developing in Lithia Springs, we will deploy probably north of 50 people. And those will all be very high paying jobs. To your point, they are electrical engineers, mechanical engineers. They are skilled professionals that are drawing a well above average income for the area. And I'm going to leave because Corey is been in construction all his career. We'll talk about the construction side, which has become more like, you know, a long-term job now, because like in the case of our campus that we're developing in Lithia Springs, you know, that construction project alone will run over 5 years. And then we have other projects in the Atlanta area that people will probably roll onto. So, you know, the job picture is actually getting is much different now in this new phase of AI. And I should even mention, as we're moving to liquid cooling, personnel now are having to come in with much more technical expertise around I'm going to just say at a high level, plumbing aspects of liquid cooling. Like, you know, when you see these environments, it's not just wires and power anymore, right? It's very complex. The facilities that look more like, you know, sophisticated chip fabs or things of that nature of the past, right? It looks more white coat than, you know, than the data centers that you've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. And what you're describing here too is just, that's the building staff. Like, that's to say nothing of the company who leases this from you then, who are constantly refreshing their IT gear. There's people in and out of that building
That's right.
basically through its lifetime, right?
That's right.
Well, let's talk about the construction phase here, Corey. Let's bring you in here, and Dan voiced this just a second ago. A critique that we hear of the data center industry is the number of jobs it creates, and a lot of those jobs are attributed to the construction phase, which then, you know, as Dan has already mentioned, is critiqued as just not being that permanent. I think we've kind of heard little teasers of why that may not be true, but what are you seeing, and then like kind of what are some of the longer term implications of this for the construction industry?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we hear the concern a lot, but I think there's a few items to note here. I've been building large data centers and campuses for the last 15, 16 years across the country. You know, some in suburban, some in rural, some in cities. You know, many of our projects are really programs. They're campuses, there are multiple sites in one city. Sure, that first initial build that hits the news is 12 to 14 to 24 months. But most of the data center sites these days are actually campuses, and there may be 2 to 3 of those campuses in a city that get developed at a time to form maybe a metro region, et cetera. And within those buildings themselves, those multiple buildings, there's multiple phases. So we look at these, you know, from a construction company. The job that Chris mentioned that we're developing in Lithia Springs, Georgia, you know, that's going to employ 700 to 900 workers at peak for 4 to 5 years. And on top of that, people forget about it. When I say I'm in construction, they think I drive a pickup truck and have a toolbox. You know, you're going to employ another 150 to 200 high-skilled management, you know, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, you know, superintendents, very high-skilled and high-paid positions in those markets, on top of the actual construction labor and resources, the craftspersons that build the jobs. You know, these long-term programs bring consistent and stable work to the communities that we work in, that we invest in. You know, those 700 to 900 workers, we're spending a lot of time with partnering, making sure that we're bringing people back to Atlanta. Many people forget 15, 20 years ago, we were building data centers up in Alpharetta, Georgia, and then it sort of went dormant. Now we're bringing all that labor that left because they wanted to chase those high-skilled, high-paid data center positions elsewhere. We're bringing them back to Atlanta, and that exists in, you know, Northern Virginia, other markets as well. But you know, there's plenty of stories out there. We've already mentioned it, of construction workers or management spending their whole career really in a region, or sometimes on campus. There's people east of Atlanta, out I-20, that have been working on a data center for almost 10 years now, campus, and making a huge impact in a very rural location. I think the other thing is construction really lifts the entire community. I've been to Northeast Alabama and built a very large data center that was AI machine learning, very cutting edge. We went into a location where there was no activity, and we brought that region up. And it's not just during construction, right? We're of course staying in the hotels, we're renting housing, we're eating in the restaurants and using the service stations. You've got the vendor market bringing up trucking, storage, rentals, all of those things that support these large workforces. And that makes an impact both today and tomorrow, right? We have to recruit and train labor. So between our clients and us, we put a tremendous amount of work into how can we get people to come work at these sites? How do we train them? How do we get them to understand that safety can be done at a very high level? Worker wellness. We do a lot of things for workers that make them want to work on data center sites. And by all of that, we're really bringing up some of the highest paying positions in the construction industry. We're providing the best training, the best worker conditions, the best safety, wellness, and we're making an impact that outlasts the data center program itself, right? You're really bringing up the infrastructure to build in those regions, even past that development. That carries on before, in some of the longer term scenarios. We're also seeing the vendors that we use to build the projects and those craftspeople that are really invested, they go on to support Chris's team in operations with upgrades, with maintenance, with retrofits and end of life, and that goes on in perpetuity at the data center.
Let me come back to you with just one follow-up question. As you and I were chatting on the lead up to this webinar, you had mentioned that you've built for Apple, you've built for Google and some others, if I'm remembering correctly. You'd mentioned that working for these companies is a little different, perhaps, than building a warehouse or some other commercial building. These companies just operate on a different level. Do you mind sort of describing the difference for the folks?
It's one thing that makes this industry very different. I think the only other construction element is probably oil and natural gas. It's comparable. The companies that we work with are encouraging, have the funds, have the means, have the associates to help us build safer, to push us to innovate, to focus on sustainability, on diversity, all of the things that are making us better builders. They have the means to make it important, right? When you do development, it is how fast and how cheap can you do it. This is about how can we improve construction in general, right? The introduction of really manufacturing techniques. Google Data Center is really leading with a design for manufacturing and assembly type approach, where they're really trying to build these things in safe environments and ship them as a supply chain to locations and assemble them with ease and in a safer and better working conditions. So there's lots of stories out there like that, Dan.
I mean, it makes sense too if you think of it. Like if news broke that Apple, were mistreating workers, that would be on headlines for weeks, right? I mean, we can count on that. So, not that that's the only reason that they're doing it, of course, but you could bet that these companies are taking care of their workers for sure. So that's very good insight. Yeah, thanks for doubling down on that with me. Let's change gears for just 1 minute here and move back to you, Chris. I would love to kind of talk about taxation. You kind of mentioned this briefly a minute ago, and I want to circle back on that. It has been a headline recently. States offer tax incentives to some data centers, or I should say some states offer tax benefits to data centers. And what I think the audience could benefit from is to perhaps understand that a little bit better. What does that mean exactly when you get a tax abatement as a data center provider? And does that mean that all the tax dollars are given away, or are there other taxes that you might pay that aren't covered by these state incentives?
Yeah, I mean, data centers are huge taxpayers, and I mean, it was just said earlier, that's actually one of the main drivers in terms of them being attractive economic development projects that communities compete for. And the reason is because if you think about and I'll just talk about the direct taxes, not even derivative taxes that workers pay and things of that nature, but data centers pay during the construction process. They're paying sales tax on the equipment that is being used to build the data center, and then once the data center is complete, they're paying both real property taxes on their building. They're paying personal property tax on the equipment that was used to build the data center. And then generally speaking, depending on the location, they're probably paying taxes on all of the power that is consumed in the data center. So when you add all of that up, you're talking about what can be tens and tens of millions of dollars on a single data center location to a community. Because data centers, and then that doesn't count, customers then put equipment in that data center on which they pay sales tax, and then they pay personal property tax. So you just get this incredible concentration of tax revenue on a very small piece of land that, because the job numbers, while they're important and they're getting better, are not huge relative to something like a logistics building or a manufacturing facility, you don't have the impact on the community that is costing them money. So that what they do get is almost just like straight to the bottom line net profit. All states, because these are such rich tax generators, compete for this business, and therefore they do offer incentives. Some states will limit the amount of sales tax you have to pay on the equipment you buy to build a data center. Others might offer abatements on a portion of the property tax that is paid on a data center. But in all cases, these jurisdictions look at it like any business looks at a business case. They look at the amount of commitment that you're making in terms of how much you're going to invest in the site. They look at the jobs that you're going to create and that you're committing to. And then more importantly, they look at the amount of tax revenue they're going to collect relative to whatever benefit they are returning. And so, you know, when you hear that a location, a government entity is offering some kind of incentive, it's really about the net benefit they're receiving, and they're looking at that competitively against other jurisdictions who are trying to get that same data center to go there. So, you know, even abated or discounted, the fact is these facilities, relative to about anything else you could put on an equal amount of acreage, are tremendous tax generators.
And then Clark, given your background, I'm just out of curiosity, are these tax abatements, is that somehow unique to the data center industry, or do other industries get similar programs?
Yeah, so Dan, I've been doing economic development for almost 40 years, and I love this question because it gets asked a lot. The truth is, economic development incentives have been around since the birth of our nation. So think about this. So here in the U.S., economic development incentives helped to develop the American West. So back in the 1800s, the federal government passed the Homestead Act and provided 160 acres to whomever wanted to move out west and farm the land. So this actually encouraged or incented people to move out west, which therein allowed our nation and our economy to grow. So incentives are really just a tool or a mechanism used to influence one's behavior, whether that is an individual person or a company. So think about it like this. On an individual basis, we are inundated with economic incentives every day. So airlines offer discounts on flights, grocery stores offer coupons, retail stores offer lower prices, employers offer competitive wages and employee benefits and signing bonuses and tuition reimbursement. So you get the idea on that. So like what Chris was saying, in the same manner, states and local governments, they decide which industries they want to recruit to their state. So in order to do this, they create and leverage economic incentives to attract businesses in order to grow their state's economy. So state governments may offer a deal closing fund when they are competing with another state with a similar or same industry. Local governments, they may offer property tax abatements or sales tax exemptions to companies. But in so doing, a state looks at its competitive advantages in deciding what types of industries it wants to attract or recruit to its state. And perhaps it has competitive advantages, or it wants to create a competitive advantage, say in the automotive sector, life sciences, aerospace, or the data center industry. So states that want to attract a certain industry will offer competitive tax rates or incentives, or perhaps tax abatements, workforce development programs, assistance with land purchases, or even infrastructure development. So this is not something that is new or unique to the data center industry. This is actually textbook economic development that has been going on for as long as industries have been looking for a place to locate, whether that's on a global, regional, state, or local level. And so, yes, so data centers, they are front and center because they provide the high skill, high wage, advanced technology jobs that states want. And data centers provide the connectivity, the low latency, the compute power, the secure storage, the data technology that touches, drives, or enables most every modern business on the planet. So yes, data centers are on the front line, and they're very desirable because they are the great enabler of modern day technology.
I love that you took us all the way back to the 1800s there. I didn't see that coming. That was great. I would love to have 160 acres.
I've been asked this question for almost 40 years. So, I mean, you got to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And it's a very good view, actually, and good insight. I love that. That was wonderful. Dan Golding, let's go back over to you here and let's take on this energy question. It is notable the amount of energy that data centers are consuming. And I'm just curious, like from your view, are there incentives or any kind of any reasoning why data centers would become more efficient? So, i.e., is there something that would motivate a company to be more efficient with its data center and use less energy?
So yes and no. For any specific data center, there is the most convincing driver to be more efficient, which is you spend less money. The number one cost of operating a data center is the electricity bill. And anything you could do to drive that down is something you want to do. That these are not small costs for the operators. These are vast costs. The other side of the coin, though, is we're sort of at the dawn of AI and machine learning. And so there are these vast demands for bigger and more complex machine learning models, which is going to require bigger data centers using more power. So, in some ways, even though there's quite a drive to economize for data centers and the others, and to be more efficient from a cooling point of view, on the other side of the coin, the public wants AI. And so that's what these data center operators are going to give them, but it's going to take some power to do that.
Yeah, and I love your comment there. I mean, just to kind of tease this out a little bit more for the audience, you can think of the power that is being consumed by data centers really in two buckets. One is the power being consumed by the IT equipment itself, and then one is power consumed by the cooling equipment that kind of keeps that IT equipment running at a good temperature so that it doesn't break down or degrade over a shorter amount of time than the manufacturer intended to. It can be significant, the amount of power that the cooling draws, and that really, as Dan was alluding there, that's where a lot of these efficiency gains are. But to his point, you spend a lot less as a data center provider if you can drive that efficiency, because ultimately you're not spending as much on cooling. So very good insights there. I guess, Clark, if I can come to you, with your background in power, I feel like you're going to have a good story to tell us here. But when we have, I mean, I guess all over the headlines are, there's transmission distribution, kind of slowdowns, if you will, from different power companies, and power companies are needing to develop more infrastructure to support data centers. And I'm just curious, in the light of that, are you seeing new kind of collaborative efforts happening between these two industries, the power industry and the data center industry, to solve some of these problems and to bring new infrastructure without costing the citizens of the community?
Yeah, so Dan, I think the simple answer is yes. The utility industry is in the business of supplying power to its customers. This is part of the regulatory construct that exists between utility companies and their customers, in that the power company agrees to supply the needed power to its customers, and the customers, of course, agree to pay the regulated or agreed upon rate. So currently, as we've alluded to, we are seeing demand for power in some locations outstripping the power that is currently available. So in these situations, we are seeing data center companies and utility companies working closer together than ever before to find the method or means to ensure that the power that is needed is actually going to be delivered in a timely, safe, reliable, and affordable manner, thereby fulfilling really the needs and the business models of both parties. So going forward, I think it's actually going to take both industries working together along with policymakers. And so when I say policymakers, I really mean commissioners or commissions, the regulators and the legislators, to solve and address the power supply issues that are currently being developed or developing. Because this is not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. Additionally, with the advances that are taking place in the data center industry with, say, sustainability and energy efficiency practices, and then layering in on top of that, the new AI capabilities, I think the data center industry working in unison with the utility industry can certainly help address these issues in a much better, faster, and more thorough manner. Now, to that end, several data center companies have already announced collaborative agreements with utility company partners for what are being referred to as clean transition tariffs. So some of these partners include Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Duke Energy, NV Energy, and others. To that point, I have witnessed firsthand DC BLOX working with its utility providers. So at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to collaboration, cooperation, and communication between the parties.
Yeah, I love that answer actually. And if we look at like Northern Virginia, kind of take it as a use case. I mean, they fully embraced the data center community. The data center community has fully embraced them. They have community planning specifically for data center. I mean, they essentially have almost like not a branch of the government, but they have like a department within the government that's specifically designed to help data centers find land, find power, and really work with them on the incentives. So I think that's another example of more than just even the power companies, but how communities have been working together. But since you called it out, Clark, I would love to go to Chris. Perhaps you can kind of add some color there on what DC BLOX have done so far to collaborate with the power companies and how that's kind of worked for you guys.
Well, I think, DC BLOX and data center companies in particular, as the supply of power is becoming more constrained, right? We have increased demand, and it's not just data centers, by the way. Keep in mind, we are repatriating manufacturing to the United States. We figured out during COVID that having everything made in China is probably not such a great idea. And we're also converting our vehicle fleet to electric. So you've got a number of things that are creating additional demands for power. And we as a nation need to expand and upgrade our power infrastructure, and data centers are providing a tremendous opportunity of investment to make that happen. So what I've seen, in terms of DC BLOX, is that our dialogue with the utilities is getting a lot more detailed because the numbers are so much bigger. So we're looking much further out in the future in terms of what our needs are. We're getting more detailed about how our needs are going to ramp over time, and more importantly, we're becoming bigger players in the financial solution. And we see this across the board. Like I look at some of the investments that we're making now, very large investments in terms of upfront capital, in terms of contract commitments to bring power so that there is a sustained view of the utility that they can make investments and know the revenue is there and the ratepayer is not going to be stuck. And so, in the end, like by the demand diminishing or anything like that. For example, it's not uncommon now that hyperscaler contracts for new data centers are 15-year contracts. Some people say, oh, we're going to ramp up all this power, and in 5 years, it's all going to go away because AI's, we're going to have a bubble. Well, that's not the lens at all that a lot of hyperscalers are looking at this from. They're making very long-term investments. They don't see the demand going away anytime soon, and they're becoming part of the solution, not just in areas I described, but also we said earlier, alternate, green energy. Hyperscalers are making very large investments, adding green energy to the grid, becoming its larger customer to enable that investment. And so, yes, we are big consumers as an industry of power, but we're an integral part of a nationwide effort to upgrade and expand that infrastructure that we need for our future.
That was a fantastic point, actually, that you just made there, and I want to make sure that we say it again, and that is, as the ask for power, the demand for power has increased, so also have the length of contracts. So the idea that this is somehow a bubble, I guess perhaps we could say in theory, maybe it's possible, but nobody's betting that much. And when I say nobody, I mean Microsoft, Amazon, like the largest of companies. They're not thinking this way, and they're planning, not betting, they're planning, as you mentioned there, Chris. That's fantastic. Very, very good. And the other point that you made there that I want to circle back in on is, so I sit within the data center services and infrastructure team. Within S&P, there's a whole other division of folks that just look at energy, and so they're looking at power, sort of the energy transition across the globe. And you hit the nail on the head. What they're saying about data centers is that the data center industry is essentially a bellwether. This is the tip of the iceberg when we consider electrification of our vehicles, moving manufacture to electricity, electrification of residential. There is a coming wave of electricity demand that will far eclipse what we're seeing from the data center industry today. It just so happens that the data center industry is sort of leading here. And so if anything, it's teaching the grids, hey, here's some things we need to start thinking about, and perhaps even ways that we could approach that. So that was a very interesting thing you just brought up there. We are rounding up our time here, and I just want to remind everybody, if you've got a burning question, please feel free to pop that in the chat. We'd love to be able to address that in just 1 minute. Before we move on, though, to the Q&A section, let me just bring up the last question of our time here, and let me just go back to you, Chris, if you don't care. Let's talk about water usage. So one of the common critiques that we hear of the data center industry is how much water these facilities use. First and foremost, is that true? And then secondly, is there a way to curb water usage that you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll be brief, and then I think, Dan, gosh, having lived engineering in a hyperscaler for a decade, has great perspective on this. But the data centers historically have been criticized for water consumption, and that is because large data centers historically used evaporative cooling for their large loads. Evaporative cooling historically was much more efficient than refrigerant-based cooling, which is similar to what we use in the split systems in our homes. What's happening now is most data centers are moving to refrigerant-based systems. The efficiency gaps have been closed. And so, for example, at DC BLOX, I can just speak for us, we don't use evaporative cooling. We use all refrigerant-based cooling. And so our water consumption looks probably pretty similar to that logistics warehouse that would have gone on our site had we not put a data center there. We have very, very efficient water utilization, especially compared to what data centers did in the past. But Dan, maybe you can dig in a little deeper. I know that's your area.
Yeah, so this is a challenge. One thing to keep in mind is there are places in North America where water is very dear, and there are places where it's not. There are places where there's plenty of water. There's also a lot of places where reclaimed water is available, gray water. And in a lot of cases, data centers are connecting to those gray water sources, so the water they're using isn't potable. We are seeing, as you mentioned, Chris, a lot more adoption of what's called dry cooling or sort of air cooling, where we're not using large amounts of water. One area that people tend to get kind of confused about is water-cooled chips, like cooling to the chip using water as a medium. There's sort of this idea that uses a lot of water, but that's a closed loop system. So even if we're doing a lot of AI or machine learning, we've got a lot of GPUs, and we're sending water directly to those chips, that water is in a closed loop. It's not going to get used up. Once we charge that system, that's it. But there are a lot of misunderstandings that having AI implies large amounts of water usage, but that's not actually the case.
That's a wonderful point, actually, and oftentimes it's not even water that's being used in the chips. They call it water cooling, but it's actually an oil. So it's a dielectric fluid that's designed to not conduct electricity, and so it's a bit of a misnomer there. Some systems do, in fact, use water, but a lot of them don't. So great point there, Dan. Thanks for that. So now we've got, gentlemen, we've got a number of questions that have rolled in here. So we'll just do a fireside chat round here if we can. A number of questions actually, which I would love to kind of circle in on, is essentially getting at why do data centers choose the locations that they do. And Chris, I'm going to start with you if I may, because you have an intense view on this as you do site selection as your job. So why do you pick the spots that you pick?
Yeah, well, you might imagine it's customer driven. And I think, and by the way, this is an area that is changing. So, historically, when we looked at the rollout of, excuse me, when we look at the rollout of cloud-based services from companies like AWS and, Google and, Microsoft, they tended to concentrate in, tier 1 markets on a regional basis around the United States that allowed them to reach the majority of the population within a relatively small number of milliseconds, like let's say 3 milliseconds. So that's where we saw locations like Northern Virginia and Chicago and Dallas and LA and Northwestern, kind of Seattle, Washington area emerge as what were historically these hyperscale centers where all the data centers were going. But what's happening now is with AI, we have had this increased demand for power, and power is not available everywhere. For example, in Atlanta right now, power is very difficult to attain for a new data center location, as it is in many other places where we've had a lot of development. So, we're now in a phase with AI that, data center locations are starting to spread out and go where these pockets of power are. And I think that's kind of what we're going to see next. So you're seeing data centers built in all kinds of interesting places, bringing jobs to areas and tax revenue to areas that never had an opportunity like this in the past. And that's kind of where we are. So we choose based on where customer demand is, and now increasingly, honestly, it's where, because of the power requirements, where we can get power.
Yeah, so let me take this down over to Dan, since Dan, you work for a customer of data centers, so would have been driving some of these conversations. What was some of the logic that you have applied over the years on choosing locations?
Yeah, so historically, you put data centers near other data centers. That was always really the safe location strategy. That's how places like Northern Virginia, New Albany, Ohio, Atlanta, that's how they gain more data centers. There is a second mover advantage. Once the network is built, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to put additional data centers in the same locations. But to some of the points that have been made, a lot of those traditional locations are absolutely out of power now. At the same time, you've got AI demands that aren't as latency sensitive as a lot of the historic demands for things like cloud. So what you're seeing is a lot of the end customers doing what you might call a lifeboat drill. They're putting the loads that are very latency sensitive, right on top of internet exchange points in places like Northern Virginia or Dallas or Chicago, and they're taking other loads and they're moving them some distance away. In the case of something like AI inference, they could be moving that 100 miles away. In the case of AI training, there are now loads that are absolutely latency and location insensitive. It doesn't matter where you go. So you're seeing some data centers being built in truly remote locations like North Dakota. And I think that's a pretty big change in location strategy that we've seen just in the last year.
And let me come to you, Corey, if I may. You're at the tip of the spear here of data center development and site selection. If you don't mind, without divulging anything secret, where are you seeing some developments that play out that perhaps are not traditional places for data centers to be built?
Yeah, it is changing wildly. I would say we're, in the Southeast, Atlanta has obviously emerged as now a major market, in the top 3. But you think about the Carolinas, very business friendly, power friendly, industrial friendly. We're seeing quite a bit of activity. But other places, Mississippi, Texas is really, really hot anywhere just based on cost of power. And then the Midwest there's lots of announcements in places that you would never think there would be a data center. It's really anywhere where our customers can get their hands on power right now.
And let me so one of the questions that's come in, Clark, I feel like you could probably address here. If you're a city or a planning committee and you're wanting to attract data centers, how do we go about this? What message do they need to take to the market here that would be attractive to data center companies?
So I think the best way is to make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel. I think if you look at those communities that have been very successful in attracting the data center industry to their locations, that's a starting point. Look at what they're doing. Because just as the other panelists mentioned in the site selection criteria, the other things that I would mention, some of the ancillary factors would include, do you have a business-friendly environment? Do you have a business environment that is conducive to the data center industry? Do you have the available skilled labor? Do you have workforce development programs? Do you have a robust public infrastructure? And then the other things to keep in mind is the quality of the schools. And even more importantly, in some instances that people look for this day and time is the quality of life and the quality of place. That's, on top of incentives or anything else that you could do to attract that type of industry to your location.
Yeah, it's very good, very good. It looks like we have time for about one more question here. I'm going to ask you all, if you don't mind, to pull out your crystal ball and let's make some predictions here. One of the questions that has come in is, do we have any predictions for upcoming hotspots for data centers? Let's go around the horn if we don't mind. Chris, back to our alphabetical order, if I may. What's your thought? What's an up-and-coming data center market or hotspot from your view, sir?
Well, DC BLOX is focused in the Southeast, so I'm a little bit biased, but I'm going to just say the Southeast is exploding. I mean, when you look at all of the recent announcements, and there are so many more coming that, we know about that aren't public yet, the amount of gigawatts going across the South, we just saw, Amazon 10 billion into Mississippi. And the exciting part is, like I said, they're going in communities that have not had this kind of investment before. And so I'm just saying, what you're going to see happen across the South is going to be remarkable. It already has been, but it's going to be even more than you imagine.
What do you think, Clark? Ideas for hotspots or predictions for hotspots?
Yeah, so I'm going to take the same tack as Chris. I'm not going to call out a particular state or location. I do think what you will see is more of what's evolving now, and that is you're seeing some what I'll call non-usual suspects that are now entering the picture. These are typically what I would call secondary markets. So maybe on the periphery of some of these primary markets. And then as some of the other panelists have mentioned about water and power, so you've got that confluence of water and power that's taking place. So I think you're going to have to start looking at locations that can really address those cooling or water issues along with the available power.
Very good. Corey, what about you? What's your crystal ball telling you?
My answer is going to be a little bit different. My answer is globally. I think the enormous, the U.S. is very far ahead in this journey. You're seeing a recreation of the entire fiber network domestically and globally. At each one of those nodes is a little data center or a big data center in major markets. It's not just the huge sites. We're going to see those secondary, tertiary, and rural markets really see even small data centers to move all this traffic around globally in the speed that it needs. Companies like ours are preparing to build internationally to support our customers. And the data that we manage tomorrow will always be more than today. So that's my prediction.
Yeah. Dan, bring us home, sir. What's your thoughts?
So I'm going to throw out some really specific markets. Southern Poland coming up, Charlotte, North Carolina, Louisville, Kentucky, and of all places, North Dakota.
All right. You care to explain?
It's I think these are places where there is a lot of activity going on right now. There are multiple processes going on in Charlotte. I think where hyperscalers are buying. There's a 400 megawatt campus going up in North Dakota. Louisville, Meta has built there, and there's an additional very large development preparing to be built a little further south. I think in southern Poland is a fascinating area because I think the Polish government is super friendly to data center development. So I think you're going to see 500 megawatts in all of these places pretty darn fast.
Very interesting. All right. Well, we went from high level to very specific. I love it. Great answers all. And with that, we are up on time. And so I hope you as the audience have enjoyed this as much as I have, the moderator. It's a very interesting conversation, I thought. Alyssa, maybe if I could have you bring us home here, if you don't mind. Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.
My pleasure. Yeah, what a great conversation. Just a reminder for everyone, if you missed any part or you want to replay any part, a replay of this program will be sent to you. We encourage you share it. And if you're going to share anything on social media, please tag our esteemed panelists and, of course, Dan Thompson, our moderator. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time with us today. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
All right, great job.
Nice.